Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Kath and Jo, for putting together this training around, what are the ways in which we can start to think about or continue to think about protecting ourselves in this post-Dobbs decision world. I think we all saw from the way that the decision was handled and some of the legal aspects of it, after really pointing towards what I saw as a foreshadowing of what some of the folks in the Supreme Court have in mind as to take on once the abortion was overturned. Roe v. Wade. So in that, we thought that it would be a good time to engage our Dr. Jo Trigilio, who's on the team at the Chamber, and Catherine Cappelli, who's one of our members and an attorney, to walk us through what are some of those things that we need to think about as we, even now that some of us are married or not, to find some protections for ourselves as these movements, these particular attack on our communities are out there, and also explain a little bit more about, what is out there legally and from an education perspective. So I want to turn it over to Jo so that we can start the conversation and just really bringing this as a resource for the community. Thank you for being here and for watching. Jo.
Hello, everyone. Give me a second while I share a screen and get us started. Welcome, everybody. We are going to talk today about the Dobbs decision, specifically as it relates to businesses, what you need to know to protect your employees, your families, your customer, your clients, and the LGBTQ community. Just a little disclaimer. This information session does not provide legal advice, as the laws around abortion and LGBTQ rights are changing quickly and are different in every state. We recommend speaking with a lawyer about your individual rights and also what you should do as a business. Overview. So this is what we're going to cover in the next hour. I'll be giving you a summary of the case. Kath will be talking about the LGBTQ related impacts. I will talk briefly about what businesses can do to support LGBTQ employees, etc. And Kath will talk about what we can do to protect the rights of reproductive freedom for everyone. And then we'll have our Q&A. Introduction. So in June 2022, the Dobbs decision was handed down and it overturned Roe versus Wade. That decision had been leaked, but I think actually in the day that it happened, many of us were very, very shocked. We're very shocked by it. Roe versus Wade was based on the due process clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which protects privacy rights and the right to abortion. This was the way in which all of our privacy rights were being protected in the constitutionally was Roe versus Wade. And so having this overturned has broad implications. The Dobbs ruling effectively eliminates Americans' rights to make decisions regarding their own reproductive health. It strips away the fundamental and essential human right to bodily autonomy. Bodily autonomy is the right to make decisions over what happens with your body. And when we look at oppressed groups, it's one of the first things that is violated is their right to bodily autonomy. So who is this going to affect? It's going to affect, women, people of color, LGBTQ people, the disabled. It dislodges 50 years of progress in the area of women's rights, privacy rights, rights to bodily autonomy, and gender-based social justice. As I said, it has broad implications. The impact of the Dobbs decision, the ability of cis women and those who can bear children to control their reproductive lives has a direct and immediate economic impact on their lives. Women with unplanned pregnancies who cannot access abortion care are statistically more likely to not pursue education, be unemployed, earn less, experience economic instability, and fall into poverty. And I used to teach college, and if a student got pregnant, it was so hard for students to stay in school. They would try, but it was really, really hard. And students who had children, getting your 4-year education is really, really challenging, or even a 2-year education is really challenging once you have a child. Restricting access to abortion care will disproportionately harm the poor, the working class, people of color, disabled people, people living in rural areas, immigrants, and LGBTQ people. Disadvantaged groups are most likely to be criminalized by laws that make reproductive care illegal. And, I should just also say that a lot of the reproductive controls on women's bodies have been exercised on the bodies of women of color. That includes court-mandated reproductive care. I shouldn't call it care. Reproductive, forced reproduction control is what I should say. And here's the part that's most concerning, I think, is that the concurring opinion submitted by Justice Thomas indicates that same-sex marriage, the right to contraception, and the right to private consensual sexual relations are all in jeopardy. So these are some of the things that are at risk of being overturned. Number 1, the federal right to same-sex marriage. Number 2, the right to contraception. And number 3, the right to private consensual relations. And I will turn it over to Kath.
Thanks. You just want to leave that up, Jo?
Sure, if you want.
Yeah, that's fine. So thanks for being here today. I wanted to talk about the specific impacts of this Dobbs decision on the LGBTQ community. And we'll start with, if you want to switch, you can switch to the next one. It threatens all of these things. It threatens reproductive freedom. It affects and threatens assisted reproductive technology. It threatens same-sex marriage and relationships. It threatens LGBTQ parenting rights, and it also threatens gender-affirming care. And I'm going to go into each one of these a little bit. And since we have, not a ton of people here today, please put your questions into the chat box, and we can address them as we go along, perhaps. So with the threats to reproductive freedom, who's affected? Jo covered this pretty well. Anyone who can get pregnant. So it's not just cisgendered heterosexual women. LGBTQ people experience unintended pregnancies, some as a result of sexual violence. So that includes trans men and gender expansive people assigned female at birth. More than a third of lesbians and over 80% of bisexual women have experienced at least one pregnancy, and the rates of unintended pregnancy are even higher for brown and Black lesbians and bisexual women. In reproductive care, how is it at risk? Well, if we start to limit the access to reproductive health care, the LGBTQ community is going to be significantly affected. We recognize the intersectionality of all the layered oppressions and the discriminations that is more, and people who are more adverse to accessing medical care and have always faced economic and social barriers to contraception and regular gynecological and reproductive care. How specifically Dobbs affects pre-Dobbs, I believe there were 12 states that had trigger bans that whenever Roe was overturned, that state would have their law already in place. Now, the trigger laws turn on what that particular state, how they define abortion. For example, Arkansas defines abortion as the act of using, prescribing, administering, procuring, or selling of any instrument, medicine, drug, or any other substance for the purpose of terminating a pregnancy. So that means that the morning after pill, Plan B, is banned. Arkansas also defines pregnancy as the existence of an unborn child at the moment of fertilization. So these trigger laws could also be used to impact birth control itself. Birth control, the types of birth control used to preventing a fertilized egg from implanting in the endometrial lining, the lining of the uterus, which is the pill essentially. So that because the fertilized egg is already deemed to be an unborn child according to their definition. So the action plan, you probably have heard about the new Massachusetts law. Governor Baker signed it August 1st. It's called an act expanding protections for reproductive and gender affirming care. Vice President Kamala Harris, who was here over the summer, she held it out as a model for other states to follow. It legally protects reproductive health care and gender affirming services in Massachusetts. Its updates are, we had a 2020 Roe Act. It ensures that patients over 24 weeks of pregnancy are able to receive an abortion because of a grave fetal diagnosis. But then it puts in a lot of protections in anticipation of what's happening around the country. For doctors, it prohibits the medical boards of registration from disciplining or taking adverse actions for doctors who are applying if they assist with reproductive health care or gender affirming services. It affects investigations. It prohibits mass law enforcement from assisting with an investigation by federal authorities or by another state's authorities or private citizens related to legally protective reproductive and gender affirming health care in Massachusetts. For residents, it provides residents with protection to enforce a court ruling from others against having a court ruling from another state enforced against them. It prohibits a Massachusetts court from ordering a person in Massachusetts to give testimony or produce documents in connection with an out-of-state tribunal that's challenging legally protected health care here. And it protects from a judge here issuing a summons for a Massachusetts person to be brought to another state for their state's prosecution under their new anti-abortion laws. So what else can we be doing? One of the things that it's important to think about, especially for parents of college-age children, is to think about where that child will be going to school and what kind of reproductive care is allowed in that particular state. And certainly we're going to talk a lot about education and other action plans later on in the presentation. Okay, Joe, thanks. All right, assisted reproduction. I'm a family formation attorney. Assisted reproduction is family formation science, and it's used by everybody, and it's used by the LGBT community almost 100% of the time. Not quite, but IVF and assisted reproduction include any medical alteration of the reproductive cycle, the harvesting of eggs, the implanting of embryos, the decisions, medical decisions for selective reduction, destruction, and genetic testing. So I just talked about who's affected, but it is potentially at risk because of the new definitions of both abortion and pregnancy. There are also actual personhood statutes. I believe it's Louisiana that's had one for quite a while. If an embryo is constitutes a person, there can be all kinds of criminal prosecutions for homicide and civil rules that will protect that embryo. Some states require adoption of embryos because people go through an IVF cycle and they don't necessarily use all of their embryos. They store them for a period of time at extraordinary costs. But if they want to destroy them or donate them for scientific research, those two options may be gravely affected. As far as an action plan goes, here in Massachusetts, we have pending legislation called the Massachusetts Parentage Act. We are the only New England state that doesn't have updated parentage laws. We've been ahead of the curve on a lot of things. We are way behind on this one. We're leaving children vulnerable to many harms, including being separated from their parents. We have case law sort of cobbled together to protect parenting rights in this situation, but Massachusetts courts and judges really need better guidance and comprehensive policy around protecting the relationship between a non-biological parent and a child, especially if that family is going to travel outside the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Mass has the highest rate, I didn't know this, we have the highest rate of births through assisted reproduction in the country, but our statutes don't adequately protect those children. So that's why the Mass Parentage Act is really critical. We need clarity that the gamete donors are not parents. In talking about action plans, we certainly would ask that you contact your state representatives to make sure that they pass this legislation in the next legislative session. All right. Marriage. Joe mentioned the Thomas concurrence. He cited those 3 cases in his concurrence, the concurrence that wasn't joined by any other justice, but he put right out there, Obergefell, Griswold, and Lawrence challenging that there may not be a federal right to same-sex marriage, to contraception, and to private consensual sexual relations. The concern is that as there are people out there already that are using the Dobbs decision in these areas. July 2022, attorneys general in Texas and Alabama were using the Dobbs decision to resurrect anti-sodomy laws. One of the things that's really important for us in Massachusetts is to think thoughtfully and transparently in getting into a relationship and forming your family, and to use prenuptial and marital agreements to actually protect your relationship if marriage is to go away. So securing all of the things that marriage secures. When you get a marriage license in Massachusetts, you're signing up for a whole laundry list of rules and regulations if you are to ever dissolve that relationship. So this way you can sit down with a mediator or with an attorney and draft something that fits your life plan, but certainly that protects your relationship, your ability to inherit from each other, your ability to have property together, and your decisions around having children. All of those things can be done in prenuptial, and if you don't do it right before your marriage, you can do it afterwards in a marital agreement. It's also a living, breathing document that you can change as your life changes. It doesn't have to be written in stone, and it also is something that is not on file with the court. It's totally private. Estate planning are also documents that you should have to protect your relationship. Wills and trusts, power of attorney, healthcare proxies, so that the person you want designated to make your medical decisions is clear. And in collaboration with that, a HIPAA authorization, because you want the person who has the ability to make those decisions to also have access to your medical documentation. If they can't look at anything, it may be harder for them to make an informed decision. And other legal agreements. There may be domestic partner agreements if you're not married, real estate agreements, those sorts of things to protect what you want to have happen in your relationship. It's your plan, and you have the ability to make it. So I've talked some about parentage. The legal recognition of parents in Massachusetts, if you're married, in 2012, the case of Hunter v. Rose, the presumption of parentage applies to married same-sex couples regardless of the couple's gender. So, and then with Goodrich, all of our statutes are supposed to be read gender neutrally. So if there is a child that is born after the date of the marriage, it is presumed to be the child of those two parents. And we have changed up birth certificate application forms that are now gender neutral. So you sign the birth certificate at the hospital, the two same-sex parents can sign it at the hospital, and people think that they're good to go, and that child is protected, that parentage over that child is protected. It's really important to recognize that a birth certificate is not a court judgment. So court judgments receive full faith and credit when they are brought to other states. If you go and get divorced in another state, if you go and just travel in another state and you end up in an emergency room, there have been states that have denied parenting rights to a non-biological parent. And that is a horrifying situation. It requires years of costly litigation. The Supreme Court a couple of years back did the right thing and said, no, non-bio mom is the parent here. So they flipped that state's decision, but it took 2 years of costly litigation, and it was a different Supreme Court when that decision was made. So it's really important to make sure that you are legally securing parenting rights. And you do that through a confirmatory adoption. I'm in a same-sex relationship. I had a child, and we had to go and do an adoption of our own child. And my partner found that to be extremely humiliating and awful. But it was something that we needed. We needed that court judgment for protection of parenting rights for our child. If people are unmarried, an unmarried same-sex couple, there is something called a voluntary acknowledgement of parentage form. It's a state form available online that can be filled out at the time of the parent's, the time of the child's birth. And also with assisted reproduction, if a child is going to be born through a surrogate, there are ways to work with an attorney to get a pre-birth order naming the intended parents. It's really important to talk to an attorney that specializes in this area to be able to make sure your parenting rights are secure. The beautiful thing about Massachusetts a couple of years back, because there was so much concern with the prior administration, there were all of these couples were going to court to secure an adoption for their 12, 13-year-old child. Child didn't know why they were there. These have been my parents forever. But they wanted to secure those orders. So the probate court, for the most part across Massachusetts, will do this administratively. It's a lot of paperwork. You should have an attorney help you with the proper filings that need to happen, but it can be done administratively and you don't actually have to go to court. I don't get to see the babies anymore, but that's another story. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
The threats to gender affirming care. The Dobbs decision affects gender affirming medical care because it affects bodily autonomy. If bodily autonomy is no longer protected, other medical care is potentially at risk. Gender affirming medical care is the medical standard of healthcare for transgender and gender expansive adults and for children. Why? We could talk about that for a while, and there's been a lot of talk in the news lately, but it certainly saves lives, and it helps people to be who they are. And it helps with gender dysphoria, depression, suicidality, and self-harm. And it's not just about medical intervention, it's also about social affirmation. But as far as the medical intervention with psychological support, there are puberty blockers, cross-hormone therapy, and gender affirming surgeries, all in conjunction with working with your medical provider. And as you probably know, too many states have passed or have legislation pending to ban gender affirming medical care for trans kids. And now people are using the Dobbs decision already in this area. April 2022, the Governor Kay Ivy from Alabama. She signed a law making it a felony punishable up to 10 years in prison for a doctor to prescribe puberty blockers or hormones to minors under age 19. And it banned genital and reconstructive surgeries on minors, which weren't performed in Alabama to begin with. An Alabama governor had already cited Dobbs in support of these bans, saying that these are not rights that are deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions. I guess you could say that about almost anything. The good news is that although Arkansas passed legislation banning gender-affirming medical care for trans youth, on August 25th of this year, the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld an injunction, so a blocking of the Arkansas ban on gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth, ensuring that the law stays blocked for now. And I believe, and then there was a case in August in Virginia, the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in the 4th District held that gender dysphoria is covered by the American with Disabilities Act. So it protects gender-affirming medical care. Our own organization in Massachusetts, GLAD, GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, along with the National Center for Lesbian Rights, presented scientific research and an amicus brief, so a legal brief to help to use the ADA to prohibit this discrimination. And we, as I mentioned before, we have in Massachusetts, the new act expanding protections for reproductive and gender-affirming care. The problem is that there's certainly, with the backlash, with the activism that has happened, for example, Boston Children's Hospital, which is a leading institution in gender-affirming healthcare for youth, has been facing violent threats because of their program. They're actually working with the Mass State Police for more security for their clinics, and even renowned doctors are avoiding going to conferences to avoid the spotlight, and they've certainly stepped up their security. So kids going to the hospital really shouldn't have to face that. I think that's, so I'll turn it back over to Jo.
Sorry, my cat would like to be part of the presentation.
Oh, good.
All right, what can businesses do to support LGBTQ employees, customers, and clients? Number one, make a public statement and an internal statement supporting reproductive rights and abortion care. In fact, most Americans did not want Roe to be overturned. This is not a time to be silent. This is a time for everyone to start speaking up. LGBTQ and LGBTQ friendly businesses can't remain silent on the issue of reproductive rights and abortion care following the Dobbs decisions, because it actually does affect a lot of people. Like I said before, it affects gender minorities, racial minorities, LGBTQ people, the disabled. The kind of response a business decides to take will depend on a whole host of criteria. You know, what is the nature of your company? What's the demographic of your workforce, of your client base, et cetera? And what's the social political climate and the location that your business is in? Because all those things make a difference, because you have to play to your audience. So how you word your statement and how it's delivered, et cetera, it should be done carefully with the communications team that takes lots of things into account. And businesses should be prepared to respond to feedback and pushback, because no doubt there will be people who are not happy challenging the Dobbs. Support employees seeking abortion care. So here's some possibilities, and these are merely suggestions and things to think through. One possibility, that is, if your employees are working remotely, is to cover travel expenses for employees seeking to relocate to a state that provides protection for abortion care. That's for companies who have remote workers. Number two, cover travel expenses for unspecified medical care that's not available where the employee lives. This is a a workaround to avoid stating what it's for in case certain states try to prosecute people for assisting people getting abortion care. And certain, it's not clear whether or not certain states will go after individuals helping people attain abortion care. So I think individuals and companies need to be careful. Cover travel expenses for employees traveling to states that have abortion care. Again, with an eye to what the state, wherever it is, what the state is, what the laws are there. Act with integrity. And this is really important. Don't support political candidates who take anti-reproductive choice positions. In fact, this is the time to support candidates who are pro-reproductive rights, because we can, in fact, this can be righted. Like, this doesn't have to be the way that it is. We don't have to stay this way. We can actually start passing laws that protect privacy rights, all kinds of reproductive care. Don't support candidates who don't support women's rights, LGBTQ rights, or those who support anti-racist policies, because in fact, we find that these things are all connected. Candidates who are anti-women's rights are also pro measures that are racist and anti-LGBT. These are all right, especially right now in the political climate, these things are wedded. So when you see one, you're going to find the others. So, I caution against single issue kind of, politics, and to instead start looking at intersectionality and observe the ways in which some of these things all get connected in the political sphere. What you can do to protect the rights of reproductive freedom from all people. That's Kath.
Yeah, what can we do? I hope that people have been inspired to start to think about action. I'm sure folks already are doing a lot. You can change the slide, Jo. So it's okay. I don't know about you, but I really feel like the opposition is very loud these days, and their numbers are being portrayed in the media a lot. So I think it continues to be very important for us to show numbers and to be out there in the street and participate in public events and demonstrations. Don't wait until just to vote in November. Make your voice heard now. And social media really has a limited impact. The algorithms are such that it's most likely that you will end up just preaching to the choir, this people who believe what you believe. And like we've said, the assault on bodily autonomy is real. So we need to take some actual action outside of the virtual spaces. So engaging in activism and community organizing efforts, we need more activists and organizers within whatever group that you're involved with. Or also joining new organizations and activist groups that advocate for the rights of women, reproductive rights, people of color, LGBTQ people, the disabled, the elderly, and the poor. Attend events by these organizations and volunteer in whatever fashion that you can. And vote. That seems to be the most basic things, but encourage others to vote and educate. Make sure you're registered, but educate yourself on these issues so that you can educate others. Educate yourself on the candidates that support these rights. Pay a special attention to local and state elections that support social justice efforts, and consider getting out there and campaigning for any of the candidates that you feel strongly about. Also, support legislation that's already out there. The Federal Respect for Marriage Act, it passed the House in July, and it was supposed to come up for a vote in the Senate prior to November. And for some reason, it has been put over until after the November elections. So get on the phone and email and contact your senators about that. There were on September 14th, Governor Baker and over 400 Republicans, conservatives, and libertarian leaders actually signed a letter calling the US Senate to pass the marriage equality bill in all 50 states. I thought that was terrific. Also, there was legislation that you probably heard about filed in September by Lindsey Graham, a national abortion ban after 15 weeks, though it includes exceptions for rape, incest, and pregnancies that threaten maternal health. And we don't want to stay silent about these things. Maybe there are a lot of people in Congress that won't agree with that, but I'm afraid there are a lot that will, especially to pander to their base. So make sure your voice is heard about that. And then financially, you can go back to the other, I'm sorry. Financially support, financially and in-person support organizations and initiatives that facilitate access to reproductive care and abortions. We have named a few. Certainly let us know if there are more that we can add to our list. We have Planned Parenthood for Massachusetts that not only is a great resource for reproductive care, it's also a great resource for gender affirming care. NARAL, the pro-choice organization, National Network of Abortion Funds, Eastern Mass Abortion Fund, Keep Our Clinics, the Apiary for Practical Support, and GLAD, as I mentioned earlier, which is our legal arm. They brought us marriage and they continue to lead on all of these issues. I'm an advocate for state and federal protections for women and LGBTQ people. I just talked about that a minute ago, but be sure to contact your legislatures and urge them to vote for any legislation that protects access to reproductive health care and abortion care and gender affirming care. Urge them to pass legislation that removes systematic barriers based on gender, race, sexual orientation, economic status, and disability. So we encourage you to ask whatever questions you might or comment on anything, please. Thanks for being here today. And also, we challenge you to share with us any of your thoughts about your own action plan.
Catherine, Jo, first of all, I want to say thank you. And I want to encourage our folks listening. I think the amount of information that I even learned, and I work in this work, is devastating, and I'm also grateful for. It's hard to even imagine that some of the things that seem so obvious are not as obvious, right? Such as having your name on your kid's birth certificate, right? That should mean something, but it doesn't. And that's the things we have to be careful about. I'd love to encourage any questions from our participants at this point so that we can get some answers to things maybe some of you are thinking about that others out there might have the same question.
You're on mute, Thais.
Thank you. There's always one. It was my turn today. I'm just going to jump in and thank Jo and Kath once again, and remind folks you can pop your questions into chat if you have any, or you can just unmute yourself like I didn't do and ask the question yourself as well. So thank you, Jo. Thank you, Kath. This is so appreciated. I'm afraid my questions are primarily related to Lindsey Graham, and I won't ask them here, but maybe we can have a separate conversation.
Go for coffee.
Well,
I think that's a beer conversation more than coffee, but
okay.
Yeah.
My question to the participants is, what is your concern? You know, like when this passed, what was your first concern? What creates anxiety? And, you know, do you have ideas for what you want to do next?
Hi, AJ Kiernan here. I have a small business called Hole in the Wall Studio where I teach voice lessons. And I actually have a very open household. I myself am pansexual, and my oldest recently, within the last few weeks, just came out as a transgender female. And my middle child, Zoe, we actually just moved schools for her because she was bullied so bad because she's a lesbian that she had to leave. She was experiencing incredible trauma. I live in a very, very small town, very rural. And while I agree with the anti-bullying sentiment that's happened at school, clearly it's also has another side to it, whereas these children who are constantly picking on her most of the time emotionally and sometimes physically, nothing was done. And it seems that there is no repercussion for that. And now with this new overturning with the Dobbs decision, I'm basically just living in fear because I have 3 daughters. And I'm wondering from a small business perspective, how I can come forward without alienating my small town students and their parents, because most of them have been very receptive. They're pretty clear on where I stand because I am a member of the chamber and I'm open about that. And I have a very large 18-foot progressive flag in my yard now. So I don't think there's any confusion, but I have definitely noticed a downturn in students because of that. And I'm just wondering if anyone, a business person who's here or somebody from a legal perspective has any take on that, or how they think that the proper way to handle that is, because I very much want to come forward passionately and say this is not okay, but I don't want to lose my job either. And it's a very conflicted place to be.
Well, I'll take that question as the chief of the chamber and say, we've had this happen before. People have come out and have lost business. Because believe it or not, I didn't believe this. I thought I lived in the bluest state in the country, but we still live in a homophobic, racist state, unfortunately, in some parts of it. I think, certainly your safety is key, and keeping yourself safe is important, and your daughter's safe. But I think that from a business perspective, as you start to lose business, reach out to us, because we can help look at your business model and figure out ways where we can be helpful in thinking of other ways that you can teach voice. It might mean you travel one day somewhere, or it might mean helping you figure out contracts with local schools, or, there's all kinds of ways that our coaches can help think through how to help you recover that. We've done that with other members in the past because we're here for each other. But then there's only so much you can do in a small town, right? And I think that's my first answer. I'll leave it to the activist. I'm an activist as well, but to others in the room who might want to answer about how do you show up with your full self and still keep yourself safe, right? Because safety's first, and keeping our kids safe is first. And sometimes that comes at a cost, certainly to our own activism. I certainly don't say nearly as much as I would have said before I had kids publicly, because it affects them sometimes, right? So, but certainly reach out to us, AJ, and we will figure out how to help you with your business piece.
I actually bought property in the next town over because the signage was so different. And the school where my daughter is going is so open. And in fact, she went to lunch the first day and was like, I don't know, maybe I'm the only person here that's gay. I just always feel weird talking about it, but it's a big part of who I am. And I feel like I can just say it. And the table started laughing. And it was like 6 other girls. And they went, come here, come here, come here. And she's like, oh no, they're laughing at me. And she's like, she thinks we're all straight. And I was like, clearly we've put you in the right place. And it's a very different field. And I am going to be able to build space on 2.5 acres where I am. So I'm grateful, but that's like 2 years down the line. In the meantime, I'm transitioning. I'm helping my brother, his business. And it's just, now I have my transgender beauty. My oldest went to a football game the other day and then was alone in the parking lot for 15 minutes. And I was in a blind panic because she's very recently come out and changed her name and is becoming more public about it. And it's like, and I know our small town and what's been happening. And it's very different. Back, before I had kids, I had the biggest mouth on the planet. And now I find myself feeling like I'm stunted vocally. And that's very difficult, especially as a performer and as someone feels very passionate about all of this. It's a hard line to walk. And so I always welcome outside perspective on that. So I appreciate it.
And I think AJ, and welcome, it's nice to see your face. Um, I think it's a hard line to walk to out in the world, because so much of the time as our kids grow up, they're the ones leading the show, right? They have their own show going on and we're not there. And I've had these experiences with my own kids where they, I hear about it after the fact, and thankfully, most of the time they've dealt with things really well and they've been able to stand up for themselves and they've been able to do what they need to do. But a lot of this happens outside where we as parents can step in and do the protective thing that we would like to do, like your daughter being in the parking lot for it's kind of like, wait a minute. So I don't know that I have an answer to that, because so it's just solidarity and we're all navigating it together. And I think it helps to recognize these spaces where, as our kids get older, they start to navigate on their own in a way that's very, very different. When my kids were little and I was much more in control of who they saw, where they saw them, how long they were there for, and all of that. Not so much the case anymore. And so I hear you. I'm with you. And if you ever want to strategize from a parental perspective, I'm happy to sit down and chat over coffee or beer.
I appreciate that. Hey, I'm at a brewery every Friday. You're welcome to come anytime you want. But the other question that was posed was, what are your next steps? And the only positive step that I can think of, and really the only thing that I'm trying to do is, I'm also on the local culture council, and I'm getting more involved with the town. And one of our members who I've become friendly with also is part of the town committee, and said, you really should take some town training. And then one of my daughter's new best friends, who lives literally down the street from us, is on the school committee. She's very open, she's very liberal. And for the first time, I was able to discuss this stuff with her. And she said that, what we really need is somebody from your community on the school committee. And I just went, it's like a light bulb. So I am taking town training and speaking more with her to try to get involved once we are in the town itself, to try to weasel my way into the school committee, because I feel like that's an area that's lacking in general. Having an LGBTQ plus community, I think it's starting to be more prevalent and more necessary, especially at the older elementary school level to the middle school level, and the presence is slim to none. So finding a way to make that part of the discussion and just making my presence known. So those are the little steps I'm trying to take to build up the community.
I think that getting on the school committee is really important, because the right, since the 80s, has been sending out packets instructing people how to get onto school committees and school boards and change the curriculum. And so it's time, I think, for LGBTQ people, feminists, and people who are anti-racist to do the exact same thing and take back our schools, because part of what's happening is that the curriculum has been changed throughout the country.
It is a very depressing thing.
PTOs as well. So sometimes school committee is a higher bar, because then you have to be elected. But just becoming involved in the PTO at your child's school can make a gigantic difference. We were able to change, for example, there used to be a 5th grade breakfast that was boys and girls. And we were able to change that to children together who are 5th graders. Through PTO involvement and people who understood that this is not really a thing. And there was resistance. And there was one particular parent who was very strident in her disagreement that there should be one breakfast. But, there are all of these, I think, entries for involvement that are sometimes lower bar and also have an effect. And I absolutely think we should take back school committees as well. So.
The other thing I can
100%.
say about small places is that a lot of people, their first impulse is to leave. You know what I mean? Like if you're in a small town and it feels hostile, the first impulse is to leave. And sometimes that's the right decision, you know, especially if you have kids and they're being harassed and you want their experience to not be that. But for people who don't necessarily want to leave, you can make a lot of impact in a small town with just a few allies. And I think because so much of what's happening is actually happening in small towns, it's really important that people in small towns that want to stay in their small town actually start taking action, finding who their allies are, and forming like communities of empowerment. It's a lot easier than you think, especially in small towns when you can have like dinner parties and everyone, you know, knows one another and it's, you know, parking's not an issue. It really is easier to organize on the ground and form informal and formal networks really quickly.
Yeah, we've been
It
trying
sounds like
for
you're already
almost 7
doing,
years.
it sounds like you're doing that.
Yeah.
Sounds like
We
you're
are
already
trying. And everybody actually is, a lot of the allies that I have found have been from, it's literally 10 minutes from here. The town where I'm moving is 10 minutes down the road. And actually the woman that works at town hall who helped me get onto the cultural council is my neighbor. I live on one end of Chapel Street and lives on the other. So she lives in this town, but works in West Brookfield where we bought property. And most of my allies come from that area because we're technically all one school district, but at the elementary level, there's different schools. And I feel like I went from like a very tough, small-minded area where it was like I was beating my head against a wall, just trying to get a chance for the parents to talk. And then I went to like, is this a public school or a private school? And the difference was astounding. And the fact that that's only 10 minutes from us, I'm like, okay, so what are we doing wrong? And we are the same district. So as a member of the PTO, and then hopefully maybe in a couple of years, moving on to the school committee, I will have a say over both schools. I will be able to vote on these things and discuss these important matters with other members and parents in the community. And it will still reach that little school where we had such a hard time. And maybe we can make some positive changes for them there.
And by then, it sounds like you already are building a really powerful network. So that's
I'm
true.
trying. I'm trying. It's
I-
encouraging
there's
to
a
have these
person-
meetings though.
Please
There's a
continue the conversation. I have to jump for a 1 o'clock, but thank you all so much. Thank you, Joe and Kath. Really powerful, scary, and eye-opening information that is definitely equipping me to protect my family as we move through these hard times. And great to hear what all we can do, because I think sometimes we feel powerless, but we actually have a lot of power. And AJ, you'll have a lot of power in the school committee.
Hope so.
And I'm sure that that's not an if, that's a when. So thank you all so much. You can continue, but I got to jump. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace.
Bye. Thank you.
I'm actually jumping as well because I have a student and she'll be here any minute.
All
So
right,
at least
AJ,
I
thank
have her, but
you.
thank you so much for the information. It is so appreciated.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Thank you.
I think one thing we need to work on is ally training, because I find that sometimes the understanding of what it means to be an ally is complicated. We can have more internal discussions. I had a really, I don't know what the word is to describe the conversation I had on Saturday night on a friend's porch with one of their friends who, yeah. So I think one step in this is creating a culture of allyship that is substantial and actual, and not just silent. You know, yes, of course I'm an ally, but if somebody's attacking LGBTQ people in a forum, I'm not going to speak up because I don't want to make anybody angry.
Right.
You know, so I think we need to maybe in our shoes as members of this community and as people who cross-pollinate allyship in other ways, right? Because there are other identities that are not ours that we need to be allies to. I think it would be an interesting place to explore.
I agree.
But
There are
different.
two questions or comments in the chat from Alex. I hear you that you're concerned about marriage and losing that protection, knowing that it's different federally than state. And I don't know if you were one of the marriages that had to do your federal filing of taxes separately, and you do your Massachusetts one jointly, and then finally it changed. And is that going to change? I go back to, as far as protections, basic contracts can help to protect your relationship. So people, think that a prenuptial or a marital agreement are somehow not harmonious with a marriage, but really they can be very binding, because it's good communication, and it's challenging all the expectations that a couple has, and putting down in writing what you want to be protected in your relationship. And Jenna, you asked about a list of LGBTQIA allied attorneys for legal support for queer couples. That's definitely what I do all day long. But there are others. But certainly if you wanted to reach out to me, I'd be happy to answer any of your questions, or if you have friends, family that you want to reach out. My contact information, I think, will be at the end of this.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Alex, is that helpful, or do you have other questions?
Oh, what questions I have? It's just an overall anxiety.
Sure.
Yeah,
That sinking feeling we all had with Dobbs? Yes.
yeah, that's kind of it. I feel very powerless.
I'm sorry.
We are certainly protected in Massachusetts. It's a question of what may happen on the federal level. I kind of take the putting off of the Senate vote till after the elections to be a good sign, because it would have been bad for them politically, because they would have had to, go to their base and all vote against it. And I don't think that all Republicans feel that way. So hence Charlie Baker's letter with all of those folks. So perhaps if it's put off until afterwards, we will get federal legislation. Stay tuned.
I have one more question if we have time, but it's kind of really in the weeds. So tell me if this isn't,
Okay.
this may not be the moment for it, but
Mhm.
it's a question about frozen eggs and how those are affected potentially by Roe being overturned, or, as far as like the IVF, it's a different conversation to have, I'm guessing, because it does feel like it's pretty, but I don't know. I just, I'm thinking of, in particular, for example, a trans man who has eggs frozen. What are the legal implications down the road for how the government could, determine whether those are fetuses?
Right. Well, if they're eggs, they're not.
Well,
So
right. So,
they're
but
not.
how,
So
if they
maybe-
were then fertilized?
But
Yeah.
potentially, if you are altering the reproductive cycle somehow, I don't know whether or not, that will be put at risk at some point. I'm sure someone will try, but I don't know. I mean, I think it's about making sure that they are housed in a facility that's in a good jurisdiction.
And I don't think eggs in and of themselves right now are in jeopardy.
I don't think so either.
Fertilized eggs are a different matter.
Right.
And I think people store fertilized eggs more often than just the egg, because I think the egg doesn't store well.
Yep.
Just
Right.
biomedical facts. The eggs don't store well.
Right. But I have a good group of assisted reproduction attorneys that I work with, and I do assisted reproduction work. So I'm very much staying on top of what are the ART friendly, assisted reproduction technology friendly places, both for sourcing surrogates and donors and for storing of genetic material. But happy to answer any other in the weeds questions.
Any other questions?
Any other questions?
And I just want to, again, say to Alex that I'm sorry. And it gets really emotional, I think, for a lot of us.
Yep.
So you're definitely not alone. I've it's not good. And the thing that I know about us is that we're going to keep fighting, right? That's what we've done forever. And so I think they forget that this is who we are, and we just keep showing them, and we're going to show them again that they don't get to just say we don't exist, or we don't matter, or our relationships don't exist, or they don't get to do that. And they can try, but they've been trying and losing, and they're going to continue to lose. It just sucks that we have to continue to have this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us have been doing it for decades. I was talking to Kath about this the other day, right? I came out 30 years ago, and I did not think that I would be having the same conversations about my kids that I had about my own identity 30 years ago. I thought I was done. Turns out I'm not done, but I'm just going to keep doing it then. And I'll be strident and potentially angry. So they can deal with that.
When I talk to people, I try to emphasize the ways in which all this stuff is connected, and it affects so many people, because when there's a shift toward authoritarianism, the very first thing that happens is that women's bodies are controlled. That's just like it happens over. It's a pattern in history. When you shift towards authoritarianism, patriarchy is reinforced and women's bodies are controlled. But it's not just women's bodies at that point, then it's also anybody else, any other groups that are oppressed or stigmatized. So that's why, to me, this is a feminist issue, it's an anti-racist issue, it's an LGBTQ issue, and it's a disability issue, because those are the bodies of the oppressed, and the bodies of the oppressed are the first thing to start being controlled. I mean, as you can see, no one's talking about, like, for example, cosmetic surgery, right? No one's like saying, oh, a 17-year-old shouldn't have a nose job. Right. You can see what they're targeting and why they're targeting it. And it becomes instructive. And so then I remind almost all of my friends, regardless of who they are, I can convince that they really need to start paying attention to what's happening. They really need to start getting politicized, and they need to start voting and supporting, the campaigns that are, pro women's rights, pro LGBTQ rights, and anti-racist.
Hear, hear. Thank you, everybody.
And there's a question.
Oh,
since they pushed the vote on marriage until after November, what can we do about that, since our own Senate folks are already on our side?
Do you have friends in states that are unfriendly states that you can, friends and family members, to contact their legislators? And it's not unheard of that, just because you're a Massachusetts citizen doesn't mean you can't contact an Alabama senator.
I don't know how much you can move the needle when you don't live in that state and you're just a rando who's calling in. So I mean, I'm happy.
That's why I suggested friends and family.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know. Most of the people in other states are in also progressive states that I can't do much that way. So I feel, again, like I'm not sure what I can do there.
Or those state organizations that support the National LGBTQ Association, the, whatever local organizations there are there to support.
Yeah, I just try to coordinate money and donations. Sorry, Harley has things to say too. I try to support and ask my friends to support organizations that are doing grassroots work in those states where we need people to be moved. And I know that that's not always an option, but that's one thing that I try to do. The Georgia election has seen a lot of my money. It's like, I will give you all my money, Stacy, take it. You saved us once, you're gonna save us again. So when we can have impact in that way, or when we can ask, I think, other people to have impact in that way, that's sometimes more effective than trying to have a voice where our voice doesn't super matter.
Yep.
Our dogs are together, Jenna.
Well,
Thank you,
thank
everyone.
everybody. Go ahead, Thais.
I was just gonna say thank you. Go ahead, Jo.
I was going to say thank you, everybody. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to contact us. Do you want me to show our contact information, Kath, on the screen?
Yeah. I'm so glad you folks are members of the chamber. I became a member fairly recently, and it is such a fabulous organization, and it really wants to work with us. So it does. You do.
So that's my contact information and Kath's contact information. And if you're not grabbing it right now, don't hesitate to email the chamber and we will share it with you.
Y'all know where to find me.
All right, everyone, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of this beautiful day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.